千里之行，始于足下。A journey of 1,000 miles begins beneath the feet. We now gather in the Tao to travel the journey together.
So as usual, we'll get into it with initially a reading of the chapter. 道德经 Chapter 31. A strong military, a tool of misfortune. All things detested. Therefore, those who possess the Tao avoid it. Honorable gentlemen, while at home, value the left. When deploying the military, value the right. The military is a tool of misfortune, not the tool of honorable gentlemen. When using it out of necessity, calm detachment should be above all. Victorious, but without glory, those who glorify are delighting in the killing. Those who delight in killing cannot achieve their ambitions upon the world. Auspicious events favor the left. Inauspicious events favor the right. The lieutenant general is positioned to the left. The major general is positioned to the right. We say that they are treated as if in a funeral. Those who have been killed should be mourned with sadness. Victory in war should be treated as a funeral. So as we can see, this chapter has a lot to do with military and warfare. And of course, when we translate that to the personal world, we see that as contention, arguments, fights with other people. So as we go through the English translation, you may have heard repetition from line to line. So for instance, the first line talks about the strong military being a tool of misfortune. Well, that expression shows up again in line 6 that also talks about the military being a tool of misfortune. And when you compare the original Chinese in line 1 and line 6, you'll find that indeed they end the same way, that the last characters in both lines are exactly the same. So we're going to be doing exactly that. We're going to be looking for similar characters now in the Chinese, original Chinese text up and down this chapter. And we do this because it will help us determine where the sectional breaks are. So we're literally working with the original text. So in the past, what I have done sometimes is that I go from the top down and look for similar characters in a similar position and then mark them in red. Sometimes I go from the bottom up just for a change of pace. Sometimes it's easier that way. Today, I'm just gonna jump around a little bit. When I spot repeating characters, I'll go ahead and call them out, and then we can move the dividing lines between sections where it seems appropriate. So this will be a way to demonstrate that we can do this kind of sectional analysis essentially in any order, either from the top down, from the bottom up, or jumping around in the middle of the original Chinese text. So to begin, I'm scanning up and down. I've already noted that the ending characters of line 1 are the same as the characters in line 6. In fact, the entire line of line 6, including the first 2 characters, are toward the end of line 1. There's a pause in between, but the characters are the same. Let me start at a different place further down. I am noticing another similar set of characters from line to line. And if you see them, if you see some similarities, please call them out. We'll incorporate them. So right off the bat, I can see that the last 3 characters of 15 and 16 are similar. Not exactly the same, but similar. The middle 2 characters are exactly the same, and then the last character is different. So if you look at the translation, the very last word in the English translation should provide you with a clue as to the difference in those 2 characters. So the last character in 15 and the last character in 16 are left and right, respectively. And you see them again as the last characters in 17 and 18. So 15 and 16 have the middle 2 characters in common. 17 and 18 have the middle 3 characters in common. So these are repeating characters in a poetic structure. It helps us make the determination. Looking at this, looking at the meaning side, you see that 15, 16, 17, 18 is about left, right, left, right. But for that, it's mostly talking about what happens when people glorify in the killing, how they cannot achieve their ambitions upon the world. So it makes logical sense for us to bring in a dividing line between 14 and 15. So when you do this, you've identified the final section, which starts with 15. Now, what about a dividing line between 18 and 19? So here we have 8 lines, and it seems like the last 4 lines don't have a whole lot in common with the first 4 lines in the final 8 lines. So let me say it another way. Lines 19, 20, 21, 22 don't seem to have a whole lot in common with 15, 16, 18, 17, and 18 because the final 4 lines don't have commentaries on the left and right. That's true. So you can make a case about treating the last part of this chapter as 2 subsections of 4 lines. And you can see the similarities in terms of repeating characters in the final 4 lines if you look at 19 and 22. Let me highlight those characters so they're easy to see. If you take a look at the highlighted characters, and I've used a blue color here to make it different, you can tell that 19 and 22 actually end with the same 5 characters. So they're in a slightly different position, so it may be a little hard to see, but now that they're highlighted, they should be easy to see. And when you check with the English translation, you can tell that the similar characters, the identical characters, are translated in a similar way. Treat it as if in a funeral. So treat it as a funeral. So very similar. So yes, we can definitely identify the last part as a section by itself, but note that in 19, it says, the translation says, we say that they are treated as if in a funeral. It's making a reference to the lieutenant general and the major general. So you can also make the case that the last 8 lines belong together. So the way we resolve that difference in perspective is to identify a subsection with a thin line that is not as big a section. So what else? Well, as I mentioned at the outset, we had similar characters in the beginning. Here I'm using a green color to help identify those. And here I'm showing just the last 4 characters being the same. But as I said a moment ago, the first 2 characters of line 6, you can find as the 3rd and 4th characters in line 1 as well. So does that mean that from 1 to 6, we can identify them as the same section? Well, let's not be too quick to make that determination. We need to take a look at the context, the meaning, to figure out when is Lao Tzu talking about one thing and when does he switch to a different topic. So looking at the English translation, it starts out with a statement about the military being the tool of misfortune. Okay, that's fine. Then it talks about all things detested, those who possess the Tao avoided. Okay, those seem to go together. Then it goes into the first mention of the left and right concept, which we're going to talk about in detail today. This is something that I talk about every single time we go through this particular chapter of the Tao Te Ching. So I've spoken of this twice before now. The last time was 5 years ago. And then the time before that was 10 years ago. So people who have been listening during that time, they already know about the left and right. Now, we also have a lot of people who are listening, who are coming in relatively new. So those are the people who can benefit from the same discussion on the difference of left and right. But back to the sectional analysis. Now, in line 6, it reiterates the same idea that the military is a tool of misfortune, and then it goes off on a different direction, that it's not the tool of honorable gentlemen, but when using it out of necessity, and then it goes on to talk about how it should be used. So looking at this, it becomes clear that Lao Tzu is reiterating the same idea that military is a tool of misfortune, that it's a bad thing, as the beginning of its own section. In other words, lines 1 to 5 all talk about the same topic, that the military is a tool of misfortune in one particular way, introducing the idea of left and right. Then from 6 on, it's talking about a different angle, a different perspective. That is, the military being a tool of misfortune, when it has to be used out of necessity, how should it be used? So for that reason, we can identify a sectional break in the same way. Like that. So 1 to 5, talking about this is the introductory paragraph, so to speak, that introduces the concept of left and right. Then we have the middle section there that talks about what happens when you use the tool, how should you use it, and what happens when you win. And that theme is carried throughout this entire chapter. So just to point out another similarity, if you look at 12 and 13, you see that the 3 characters there are exactly the same. They're identical. So 12 and 13 are repeating poetic structures, and they're part of this overall section that goes from 6 all the way down to 2014. So as I mentioned, these we have talked about previously. This is my third time going around the Dao De Jing. So every time we go through from 1 to 81, chapter 1 to chapter 81, it takes about 5 years because of the amount of detail that we go into. So the previous time that I went through it was 5 years ago, back in 2014. And the time before that, when I went through it, was in 2009. When I look back on the presentations that I did back in those days, I have to tell you that I see evidence. I don't feel that I'm changing from day to day, but if I compare myself to 5 years ago and 10 years ago, well, it's a huge difference. So that's what it means to cultivate the Tao, that you never stop changing, evolving, and you want to direct your evolution in the right direction, the direction that will be more beneficial to yourself, your loved ones, and everyone else around you. So there, as far as I am aware, there was no recording of the first time that I did this 10 years ago, which is probably for the best, because when I look back on that, I don't, given my perspective today, I don't feel that I did such a great job 10 years ago. The recording before this one from 5 years ago, the quality is not that great, but it can be found in the Dao Talks with Derek Lin section in YouTube, in that channel. If you just if you go into that channel, you type in 31, you'll see it. You'll hear what I talked about before. So today's talk, I'm hoping, will be an improved version of what I did 5 years ago. So let's do that. Let's talk about this line by line. So I want to start with the first 3 lines, beginning with the first line: a strong military, a tool of misfortune. So first thing that I want to point out to everyone, I hope it's already clear, that this is a clear condemnation of the military at the national level and the use of violence at the personal level. So there is zero evidence about, for instance, that Lao Tzu and the other ancient sages were ever pro-military, were ever pro or proponents of tools of violence. If anything, they were dead set against it. And indeed, Lao Tzu demonstrates his opposing stance with this emphatic line. He's basically saying that the military is just a bad thing, that there's nothing good about, nothing positive about the military. Now, later on in this chapter, he allows for the fact that it may be a necessity, that you may need to use force out of necessity, but that doesn't change his mind about the military being essentially a bad thing, by nature, a negative thing. So there's actually quite a bit more to say about that. So I'll reserve my comments for when those lines actually come up. Now, if you recall the contents of chapter 30, the previous chapter, chapter 30, that one talks about the encampment, the thorns, the hatred that when you harbor in your heart, it hurts you first, like you're drinking poison. If you take 30 together with 31, you get a really clear picture that Lao Tzu is all about peace, that the Tao is all about peace, that it's only with the greatest reluctance and realization that you failed that you engage in some kind of combat. So that doesn't change in this chapter. War, a bad idea. Violence, a bad idea. This chapter and the previous chapter spell out the perspective of the ancient sages represented by Lao Tzu on violence in no uncertain terms. it's a bad thing. So I point this out with a lot of emphasis because I want to make the following point. This is an important point. Here in the West, as we study the Tao, we encounter other people who study the Tao. We encounter people who talk about their insights, quote unquote, about the Tao, people who teach about the Tao. Now, my perspective is gonna be different from that of majority of teachers who study and teach the Tao in the West. Reason being, I have the ability to work with the original text directly. So I know with a great deal of certainty what the ancient sages actually said and what they meant. So here I'm conveying that, and this is actually a dramatic difference between what I hear sometimes in the Western study of the Tao. Here, it's saying that, well, look at that. Look at the military. It's a bad thing. It's always going to be a bad thing no matter what. In the Western study of the Tao, we have the following. It's a distorted view of the Tao, and you get a statement like this. There is no good or bad in the Tao. Everything exists as it is without judgment. To judge something as good or bad detracts from oneness. As you're listening to this, I think you may find yourself feeling, as I have, that, yeah, well, that sounds kind of plausible. That sounds like a legitimate philosophy about the Tao. So, what is going on here? Why the difference? Why is it that you get such a clear statement that violence is bad, that the military is bad, war is hell, and then you have modern students, supposedly, of the Tao who say there's no good or bad? Okay, so let me talk about the difference in perspective between the people who study the Tao today and Lao Tzu back then. So we got to understand, first of all, where Lao Tzu is coming from when he makes a statement like this. We have to understand when he lived, when he walked the face of this earth. So he will be the first to point to this philosophy, this philosophical distortion that there's no good and bad as being highly impractical. And the reason why he would say that is because he lived during the warring states period, constant warfare, constant chaos, constant killing everywhere. So back in that time, death and violence were facts of life. And sometimes, oftentimes, death and violence would occur in the most brutal and gruesome fashion. So Lao Tzu would point to that and say, okay, you think there's no good or bad, but only in the way that is perceived, blah, blah, blah. Look, someone just got his arm chopped off. Bad thing is what I would say. I would point to that and say it's a bad thing. And I would challenge you to point to that and say it's not good or bad. To judge everything as good or bad, including the arm that's just been chopped off, is to detract from oneness. How ridiculous does that sound in the face of that gruesome brutality? That's why. That is the reason. That is also the reason why, if you move that perspective to the present day, you can look at the situation that we're facing now in our country and say, oh, philosophical notions like guns don't kill people, people kill people. Let's see how you feel when you are suffering from a gunshot. Not a pretty sight, not fun. Hellacious amount of suffering. And even if you don't, can you not find some empathy to relate to someone who is suffering in that fashion. So, just a little bit more on that. Some people today may philosophize about all tools, including weapons, being neutral in themselves and only become good or bad in the way they're used. For instance, use a weapon for self-defense, etc. So, okay, fine. We can respect that people have differing opinions. So let me represent the perspective of Lao Tzu and the other Tao sages. So they actually see the different levels where such an idea can be applied. For instance, for example, let's look at an axe. An axe can be used to chop wood. It can also be used to chop someone's head off. So that seems to be a clear case where a tool can be used for good or bad. That is one level of discussion that the Tao sages are aware of. Let's go to another level and let's bring modern sages into the picture as well, or move the ancient sages to modern times when they know all about modern weapons of mass destruction. So yeah, an axe can be used to chop wood or chop someone's limbs off or head off or kill someone, period. Note that such things cannot be easily said about nuclear warheads. No matter how it's used, that nuclear warhead causes an incredible amount of death and destruction. Now, the axe is a weapon, yes, so is a nuclear warhead. Food for thought. It's fine and dandy for us to philosophize about the nature of existence and violence and peace, but what happens when we're faced with imminent destruction? Do we perhaps sing a different tune? So, in one respect, it's the same back then in the time of Lao Tzu as it is today. During his time, during the warming stage period, one had to face the reality that weapons were designed to kill or maim, period. Back in those days, it wasn't so much that you would carry a ceremonial sword, ceremonial weapons that complete your outfit, that you can wear to the ceremony and look good. No. Weapons were created for the purpose of causing harm and taking lives. So there's philosophy and then there's reality. The Tao seeks to be practical, down to earth, pragmatic about the reality we're facing and not be detached from facts on the ground, from when the rubber meets the road. Very important to realize that. The Tao is about practical everyday reality. Let's move on. Let's explore line 2. So there's a character here. For those people who know Chinese, who know Mandarin, they may actually mispronounce this particular character. So let me talk about that. And it's different when you have traditional Chinese versus simplified. So normally, this character sounds like and pinyin, the pinyin system, gives that character the letter E. This is highly misleading. Those people that study Chinese, study the pinyin system, will be taught the correct way to sound it out. It sounds more like uh-oh, the there. But those who don't know the pinyin system, who have not studied Chinese formally, who have not studied Mandarin formally, will look at E and say it's either E or A, which would not be very close to So the meaning of is evil, wicked, malicious, bad, negative, etc. Here, though, it is not used as that, as an adjective. It's used as a noun. As a verb. I meant to say a verb. It's used as a verb. It's an action. It is not used as an adjective, but a verb. So in the context of a verb, the character is exactly the same, but the pronunciation changes. Instead of it's u. So this is the case in classical Chinese as well as traditional Chinese. And there is a tendency in simplified Chinese to make all these different pronunciations unified. So you may indeed come across people who don't know, who are native speakers of modern Mandarin, and yet don't know that it's supposed to be pronounced u instead of Anyhow, let me move on because not everybody here in this meeting is studying Chinese. Let me talk about the meaning. When you use it as a verb, the meaning is to loathe, to hate, to dislike to an extreme, to be extremely averse to something, to hate it. So the line says all things detested. So yeah, that's a good word as well. To detest something is to loathe or to hate it. So here, the first two lines together is saying that the military, or in the personal world, it means the use of force. The use of force or violence is a tool of misfortune. It brings bad luck. All things detested, all things hated. So you can tell that by this line, Lao Tzu is basically saying that, look, I dislike violence. I hate it. I can't stand it. He's expressing his thoughts as he is using all things. Another context, which we're going to get to, is that all living things should detest it because all living things have life, and the use of force and violence in the military are the direct opposite to that. We'll get to that in just a moment. Here, I want to put something out to everybody. So there is hatred in the Tao. It's directed at violence. So I wanted to point to that in case you come across the distorted version of the Tao popular in the West that may actually come up with the opposite statement. The popularized, westernized, Americanized version of the Tao may actually say, there is no hatred in the Tao, there is only love. Sounds familiar? So in this chapter, you see quite clearly that indeed hatred can be in the Tao. So let me ask everyone this question. Is hatred a bad thing in the Tao? And I'm serious when I'm asking this question. Is hatred a bad thing in the Tao? What do you think? You can see it here. You can see it in the expression of Lao Tzu. Is it a bad thing in the Tao? A lot of times we say hatred is bad. Haters gonna hate. Why are you drinking all that haterade? We have a lot of expressions about that. So there's certainly a lot of negative perceptions out in the real world against hatred. We shouldn't hate. Now, I want to bring in the perspective. What I really enjoy doing when I study the Tao and talk about the Tao and convey what Lao Tzu said, is to challenge everyone's assumptions. Everyone assumes that hatred must be a bad thing. Is it really? Okay, I can see a lot of very thoughtful answers coming in from everyone. So the perspective from the Tao is actually pretty simple. Is it a bad thing? It really depends. It really depends. Is hatred a bad thing? Well, it depends on what it is you are hating. Suppose what you hate is cruelty because you wish to be kind. Suppose what you hate is torture because it's unnecessary and ineffective. Suppose what you hate is genocide because why is there ever a good reason to eliminate an entire group of people? Okay, so I'm asking everyone to go pretty deep in terms of your critical faculties, looking at everything. Superficial, what everybody pays lip service to, don't hate. Hatred is bad. Go deeper. Hatred of what is bad? What if my hatred is for stupidity? Well, historically, it's actually the hatred for stupidity that has contributed massively to the advancement of human civilization. It's because a group of people somewhere in the world decides to turn away from stupidity, turn toward understanding, learning, science, figuring more stuff about the world, that the accumulated knowledge and the application of the knowledge benefits all mankind. So when we give in to ignorance, to dogma, when we turn to, in fact, stupidity, that's when civilization suffers. So the rise and fall of civilizations has a lot to do with what people focus on, what they hate, what they prefer. If they hate the wrong thing, civilization declines. If they hate each other, if they hate cooperation, if instead they tend toward tribalism, fragmentation, civilization will suffer. So I want everyone to be very thoughtful and clear about this charged word, massively charged, called hatred. So, and in the world's great traditions, we have expressions like, hate the sin, not the sinner. So there's hatred there as well against the sin. So it comes back to the idea, it all depends. It all depends on what you hate. Civilization is protected and able to advance when people have this hatred Lao Tzu is talking about against warfare and violence. When people have an aversion against warfare and violence, peace can prevail. And people, civilization, the arts and sciences can prosper. Okay, let's move on. I gotta challenge everyone's assumptions. That's the reason why we get together on Sundays. You're not here to hear about how you are already perfect, how great you are. Let's sing the praise of some deity. No, you are here to hear about the Tao. And in the Tao, there's a huge amount of challenge to existing assumptions, to conventional concepts, to what people usually think. I'm here to suggest that you don't necessarily have to think the way that most people think. Most of you already know that, because just by being interested in the Tao, you are already different from most people. It's the same, by the way, with anger. Anger, oh, that's a bad thing. Well, in the Tao, it really depends on what you're angry about. So let's continue on. I want to cover these two lines 2 and 3, things detesting the military, and therefore those who possess the Tao avoid it. So this is where I come back to my point that, well, if you are a living entity, and I certainly hope you are, so there's a life in you. There's a life in all things that are living naturally. A strong military and the use of force are contrary to life. It exists to harm life or to eliminate life. Therefore, all living things must be opposed to them, fundamentally opposed to them. Now, we can see cases where living things must sometimes engage the use of force in order to continue on living. That's the self-defense part of it. We're definitely getting to that. For now, though, let me stick with this notion. Stick with this notion to talk about how those who possess the Tao avoid it. And let me also not stick to the military level, but move it to the personal level too. Remember, that's why we study the Tao. We want to apply it to everyday life. So when we say that all things detest the military because it's a tool of misfortune, bring that into your world, into the personal level, then what it means becomes clear. Arguments and contention, when you fight with other people, when you engage in quote-unquote warfare with other people, arguments and contention have a negative impact on everyone. People don't want it. Most people would rather that we just get along. So there's that line. Can't we all just get along? People want to get along. People want to coexist in peace and harmony. So let's talk about those who possess the Tao. So in line 3, you'll see that as the middle 3 characters from the second character on. 有道者, 3 characters. 有 means to have something, to possess something. Dao, the middle character there, well, you can see that's the same character as we have here. It's the same font too. That's the Tao. 者, those who, he who, she who, they who. So to translate the 3 characters, those who possess the Tao. And that's exactly what you see here, those who possess the Tao. All right, so let's talk about that. Let's talk about those who possess the Tao. And when we say, hatred is not necessarily a bad thing, it depends on what you hate. That's true, but let me also bring everyone's recollection back to chapter 30. So in 30, remember, it also makes the point that when you harbor hatred in your heart, it hurts you first. So as a living, breathing human being, you can't survive without feeling even just the slightest twinge of all emotions, including hatred. The work, the purpose, the goal of the Tao is to learn to recognize all these different emotions, learn that each one can be constructive or destructive, each in their own way, just like weapons being designed to harm and maim. It's a negative thing. There can be no question about the fact that, as it says in chapter 30, hatred in your heart designed to harm, just like weapons. So if you can be free from it, if it gives you, its usefulness to you is to remind you that which you must oppose, then great. But if you harbor hatred for too long, have too much of it in your heart, there's going to be negative repercussions just like having a weapon will sometimes lead to harm being done or life being taken as a result of that, having that weapon around and the many accidents that can occur in real life. So these are all linked together. Exactly. So hopefully everyone recalls from the previous chapter that where the soldiers camp, where hatred lives, thistles and thorns will grow and cause damage. Okay, let's move on with this. I think everyone is now, what I'm really happy to see is that everyone seems to be getting a really clear notion of where exactly Lao Tzu stands with in regards to warfare, the military, violence, etc. So those who possess the Tao, we're talking about cultivators, practitioners, followers, teachers, and masters of the Tao. So these people, which I hope will include us, all of us, these are the people who avoid violence, avoid negativity. And what it means is that you have no obligation, especially if you understand the Tao, there's no obligation being placed on you that requires that you stick around to suffer the negative consequences of violence. No obligation whatsoever. So those who possess the Tao see no need to be at ground zero. When you can be somewhere else rather than at the focal point of conflict, then you want to take action and get away from negativity to get yourself to a point, a vantage point where you can better practice and follow and learn the Tao. All right, so that's pretty much what I want to say about the first 3 lines. Let's move on. We have an important concept. In line 4, it starts out with 2 characters that are important in Chinese culture, 君子. So translation that you see here, honorable gentleman. Okay, 君子 can also be translated to mensch. Although for both of these translations, I want to point out that 君子 is gender neutral by itself. Let me talk about that. First of all, let me show you the pinyin. And I know native speakers will look at that and say Zhengzi. Okay, so that's not quite. The U there is the U sound and not the sound. So like the month of June. The month of June, that will be closer. Zhengzi will be closer to the actual pronunciation, 君子. So let me do that again. If you assume that Jun sounds like the month of June, the June in month of June, or the name June, and then Z, you may say Junzi, which is close to 君子. So the actual pronunciation is 君子. So important concept in Chinese culture. The meaning, a person of noble character and integrity. Notice it says person. It can be a person that is male or female. It can be a person of any gender. As long as that person is of noble character and integrity, that person is 君子, male or female. Now, usually it's translated as male, as you see here, honorable gentleman. Why? Because despite the fact that the term itself is gender neutral, by traditional customary default, it is assumed to be male. So that's the way it is throughout Chinese history, where it's usually the men who interact with the world outside of the family, and the women stay in the home. That is changing, just like everything else, just like every place else is changing all around the world. Today, it can be male or female, of the Chinese culture that is interacting with the external world. But because of the traditional default, it's translated as honorable gentleman. But I want to point this out to make sure everybody understands that we're not talking about men, we're talking about people. So for the purpose of studying the Tao Te Ching, we will assume gender neutrality. So the term applies to honorable people of any gender. Okay? Okay, now I need to prep everyone for a discussion, and then we can take a break. As you have noted, in this particular chapter, we see a lot of mention of left and right. In this slide, you're gonna see that honorable gentlemen, while at home, value the left. When deploying the military, value the right. We're about to get into a discussion of left and right, which means that it's important for me to preview for everyone that left and right carry a different context in ancient Chinese culture as they do today. So when you understand the ancient Chinese context, the rest of this chapter is really easy to understand, super easy to understand. So we had to spend some time with that. So let's talk about left and right. And I want to start by talking about the Western view of left and right. So in the West, by tradition and in our language, there has always been additional context, additional nuance about left and right. In fact, right, you know and I know, right has always had a more positive connotation. So left and right is not just the two hands that you have, the two sides of a thing. The English word right also means correct, good, proper, just. When you say, oh, that's right, you're saying, oh, that's correct. When you're talking about the right thing to do, you're talking about a correct, good, proper, or just thing to do. So the word right isn't just about one of your two hands, it's about that which is positive. Our language, our culture, our traditions are full of manifestations of this convention. For example, when you describe someone as your right hand, what do you mean? Well, you're talking about a reliable, valuable, useful helper or assistant. And sometimes people will say things like, he is my right-hand man. And that's exactly what they mean. So what about other social conventions? Notice that whenever you meet someone and you extend a hand for a handshake, it's always the right hand that you extend. No one extends the left hand, even those who are left-handed. How about in religion? Well, we know that in Christianity, it is taught that Jesus is seated to the right hand of God. So there is a long history of the right being good, proper, correct, etc. And it goes back much further than just English. Even in the days of Latin, the language, right side is dexter. Dexter is a Latin word meaning the right side. This, in English, has additional connotations. You can use the word dexterous to mean skillful, competent, quick, graceful. You can play a musical instrument with a great deal of dexterity, with a lot of skill. So again, dexter, very good context. What about the left? Would anyone happen to know the Latin for left? If dexter is Latin for the right side, then the left in Latin is also revealing. And I think a lot of people know this. A quick glance at the feedback shows that I'm right. I'm right. See what I did there? Left side is sinister. So, of course, in English, sinister means evil, disaster, ill fortune, or trouble. So there we have it. This is how it is in the West. So what about the ancient Chinese? And I specifically emphasize ancient Chinese because a lot of this ancient context over the centuries, a lot of this has been lost. But definitely back in the days of Lao Tzu, the ancient Chinese context was alive and well, and that's what we're trying to understand. So here we go. Here's the slide on the ancient Chinese view of left and right. And I underscore ancient there because in modern times, a lot of this has been lost. So in that context, right never had a more positive connotation, unlike the way it is in English and in the West. But then it never had a more negative connotation either. So let's explore, let's go deeper. So the Chinese word for right is you. It has no additional meaning or nuance, positive or negative. So you, the right hand, the right side, it doesn't mean good or proper or just. It just means the right side and that's it. And it doesn't mean the correct side, the right-handed side. Now, there is that, but then there's also the observation by the ancient Chinese. They noticed, just like most of the world, since historical times, since antiquity, most of the world has noticed that the vast majority of the people out there are right-handed. That's the way it is today as well. Estimates place the right-handed people from 75 to 95%. The truth may be somewhere in the middle. So 8 or 9 times out of 10, people are right-handed. Therefore, because most people are right-handed, the right hand is most often raised in anger. That is most often used to strike someone, to hit someone, to cause damage, used for violence. So, of course, it's not just the ancient Chinese who noted that most people were right-handed. This was the case in the West as well. This is the reason why the raised right hand, palm forward, became universal gesture for, look at my hand, it's empty. I'm not carrying any weapons. I come to you in the spirit of peace. Now, we also, in the West, by convention, raise the right hand to swear. And it just means that I harbor no hidden agenda, like I carry no weapons. I'm opening up to you, and as greeting, it's basically a greeting of peace. So when we raise the hand, hello, and we shake the hand a little bit, wave the hand a little bit, hi. When we do that, it actually comes from long tradition of I greet you in peace, look at my hand, I got no weapons. So probably the most far-reaching manifestation of this very human gesture is probably from back in the 70s. So this is back in the days when the US space program was still relatively active, was still doing things, sending out probes out into space. So in 1972, for the spacecraft Pioneer 10, and also 1973 for the sequel to that, for the successor, Pioneer 11, scientists decided to affix an aluminum plaque to the spacecraft and then launch them into space. So that plaque has engraving that looks like this. And the male and female figures standing together provide possible extraterrestrial intelligent life an idea of human anatomy. The hand that is raised probably doesn't mean a whole lot to extraterrestrial intelligence, but it is for human beings, it's become a universal gesture of greeting and the offering of peace. I come in peace. So, as I said, right never had a more positive connotation. If anything, it could be said to be a little bit more negative, because noting that the right hand is most often used for striking other people, for causing damage, the right hand has come to represent violence, and thus, opening the right hand, showing there's no weapons, has been the offering of peace in the Western paradigm. But for the ancient Chinese, they looked at the left hand, and the reasoning process goes like this. If the right hand represented violence, then it must also be true that the left hand represented peace. This is why in the traditional Chinese greeting, you put your hands together, it's always the left hand covering the right. So last time, in the previous chapter, I used a couple of stills from a movie about Ye Wen, or Ip Man in Cantonese. And that movie still showed the traditional Chinese greeting. So notice Ye Wen, the martial arts master, is putting his hands together. His right hand is in the form of a fist. The left hand covers the right hand. So what does that mean? This conveys the message that you bring peace and its importance surpasses contention, symbolized by left hand covering the right, meaning peace prevails. Peace overcomes contention. Peace is greater than violence. So, of course, all of that is wrapped together in that gesture and is simply used for greeting. So, the ancient Chinese weren't the only ones. All over the world, people greet one another using variations of peace. So for the Chinese traditional greeting, that today is still being used, but it's usually used in the context of like New Year celebration or a period martial arts movie, where you will see this quite a bit. So we can now sum up the difference between East and West. So with the Western view of left and right, I started out, I ended talking about how in the Latin language, we get clues about how left and right are seen today. The right hand is dexter in Latin. So dexterous in English means skillful, competent, quick, graceful. Whereas the left hand is sinister in Latin. And in English, sinister means evil, disaster, ill fortune, or trouble. So right away, the difference between the two is pretty stark. There seems to be nothing bad about the right hand and nothing good about the left hand. Then, on the word right, it also means correct, good, proper, just. So that when you talk about someone being your right hand, you're talking about a reliable, valuable, useful helper or assistant. So the expression, he's my right hand man. The right hand is what you extend when it comes time for a handshake. And finally, in religion, Jesus is seated at the right hand of God. So looking at this right now, you can tell the picture looks rather unbalanced. It looks like a lot of emphasis, a lot of goodness on the right, and next to nothing on the left. That's how it is in the West. So the Eastern perspective, the ancient Chinese perspective, fortunately, is a little bit more balanced than what you see here. Let's take a look. It also had the effect of summarizing everything. So first, the Mandarin character for right is you. And it just means that. It means that side, the side to the right. And there's no additional meaning in the Chinese language. It doesn't mean proper. It doesn't mean just. It doesn't mean correct. Left, 左. And again, no additional meaning. It doesn't mean good or bad or proper or improper, nothing. Now, with that as the basis, the ancient Chinese still noticed that most people are right-handed. For that reason, the right hand is most often used for violence, or the way that I said it was that the right hand is the hand that is most often raised in anger. Therefore, right hand represents violence, the yang aspect. The left hand represents peace, or the yin aspect. So let me say another quick thing about that. If you have a person who is perhaps a native Mandarin speaker who grows up in contemporary Chinese culture, that person may say 男左女右, which means male to the left, females to the right. Or more precisely, it means men, left hand, women, right hand. Well, that in Chinese culture is known as the later heaven, 后天. when we're talking about the Tao, 先天 earlier heaven, this is the scheme right here. Left hand associated with yin, peace, and right hand associated with yang, violence. So it's not a mistake that I'm presenting left and right exactly like this. This is how it was. This is the way that Lao Tzu saw the left and right. Okay, so let's now bring in left and right to the lines that we're studying. Now you can bet that the concept of left and right is infused throughout Chinese culture. And when you practice something like Qigong or Taiji, you find an emphasis that the motions, the movements that you do to one side, especially Qigong, very common, you have to do the same for the other side. You have to rotate X number of times to the right. You have to rotate the same number of times to the left. This is to help the body regain its balance. The human body appears to have external symmetry, but then we all know that the heart is situated off center. So the external symmetry is not the whole story. There's hidden aspects that are asymmetrical. Okay, let's dig into left and right further, and we'll be digging into left and right in the context of peace versus violence. Line 4, honorable gentlemen, while at home, value the left. Okay, well, now that you've seen the whole discussion on left and right, peace and violence, etc., you're going to find this line very easy to decipher. Value the left means value the peace. So now you can see valuing the left simply means valuing peace, and the whole line is talking about how honorable gentlemen, remember, it's honorable people, honorable ladies and gentlemen, I should say. Honorable people, honorable individuals regard having peace in the home as very important. Now, in the next line, it's going to be talking about how when deploying the military, value the right, which represents violence. So that makes perfect sense too. Before we get there though, let me point one thing out. This will be helpful to you as you explore Tao Te Ching in general. So let me just say, without spending too much time on it, that there are Tao Te Ching books out there that claim to be English translations, but when you flip open to 31, you see that it skips any mention of left and right. When that is the case, guys, it's not a translation. You have an author who decides to leave out an important part of 31. So what's been created? Not a translation, at least not a faithful translation. And the reason it may get skipped is because the author of that book may not feel the difference, may not be confident about knowing the difference between the left and right in accordance with the ancient Chinese culture that we're talking about here. There are also Tao Te Ching books out there that when you flip open to 31, you will see explanations, you will see the translation that incorporates left and right, but then there is no explanation on that. I would say both are absolutely necessary to qualify a book as a legitimate, authentic book on the Tao Te Ching that number one, left and right, have to be clearly translated. Number two, they have to be explained. So this gives you a simple way to assess the quality of a Dao De Jing book at the bookstore. Flip open to chapter 31. Take a look at the translation. Do you see left and right? If you do, look for the explanation. Is the explanation present or absent? If there's no left or right, or if there's no explanation, that book is disqualified. Let's move on. Let's get to the next line. When deploying the military, value the right. Well, what is that? What does that mean? So to decipher, you can guess quite easily that value the right simply means valuing the skills and capacity for violence. So here, I gotta bring in one more point. So Lao Tzu is against violence. Yes, absolutely, that's true. But notice this one thing. A Dao cultivator can be strongly against violence, but still value the right, which is the manifestation for violence. So, this is the reason why great warriors from Chinese history have very often, most of the time, been serious students of the Tao. So these great warriors might be devastating in combat, but that didn't mean they saw combat as a path to glory. In fact, it's quite the opposite. Later on, we'll see how these great warriors actually viewed combat and the victory that you can sometimes obtain from combat. So there's no contradiction here. You can be completely opposed to violence, but then still see that sometimes you have no choice. Let's continue on. So first of all, line 6, the military is a tool of misfortune. As I pointed out, this line is the same as the first line. So whenever you see something like this, it's a repetition, and it's used intentionally for emphasis. The Tao Te Ching overall is very concise. It doesn't waste a lot of words. So when things get repeated, it's an indicator of the importance that Lao Tzu invests in a particular statement. In this case, military and the use of force, very bad. So then it says that the military is not the tool of honorable gentlemen, which I hope, because you heard my previous explanation, that you will look at this and automatically see that the military is not the tool of honorable people, honorable individuals. I'm going to continue using honorable gentlemen, but I will trust you to translate it in your mind to either gender. So from the perspective of the Tao cultivator or the honorable gentleman, the use of force is not so much a tool as it is an admission of failure. So this is why line 7 says the military / the use of force is not the tool of honorable gentlemen. So this line recalls to mind a famous line, another famous quote from someone who's much more closer to modern times, a science fiction author by the name of Isaac Asimov. So in one of his books, the Foundation series, he had written this line: violence is the last refuge of the incompetent. It's the same idea. If you have to use violence as a last resort, well, you pretty much have admitted incompetence, because you weren't good enough, smart enough to figure out another way to solve the problem other than with your fists or with weapons. So violence is the last refuge of the incompetent, similar to this idea here that honorable gentlemen, honorable people, see the use of force as an admission of failure. So let's explore a little further. So line 8 says, when using it out of necessity. So this is where, as I mentioned before, the rubber meets the road, the real world test, practical everyday reality to be pragmatic. So let me ask everyone this question. What are some possible situations that may force the hand of an honorable person or a Tao cultivator? You know, not meant to be a trick question. I'm just trying to get everyone to think about possible situations. You know, perhaps you're being mugged. Although, when you're being mugged, my advice would be just to hand over material belongings and get away from the situation. That would actually not be a good scenario in my mind to use force. So what might be some possible situations that may force your hand? Supposing, of course, that you see yourself as an honorable person, or you see yourself as a Tao cultivator, or both. You see yourself as an honorable cultivator of the Tao. What may force your hand to fall back on the use of force as a last resort? Well, one possibility that comes quickly to mind would be self-defense. And self-defense is defending yourself, but what if you are defending someone else who perhaps is defenseless? Well, I would say that can be quite legitimate as well. Another possible situation is when you're trying to get away from a bad situation. Like you're caught, you're cornered, and you know that you were outmaneuvered into it, but now you need to get away from it. So it may be necessary for you to fight your way out. That's possible. So you may need to prevent someone from using force to cause damage to other people. You may need to protect other people who can't defend themselves. Especially if you think about how we encounter people who are taken advantage of because they're helpless, or animals have no ability to defend themselves, or friends, loved ones, family members who are in danger. You may need to protect or save someone. So these are all extremely valid, and these would all be difficult questions for someone who subscribes to the purest form, the most extreme form of pacifism. The Tao is not pacifistic. The Tao is practical. So it makes sense. It would not make sense for the sages to forbid the use of force. It makes sense that to recognize that force may be necessary sometimes. Sometimes you may have no choice. Having said that, though, they want to make sure that force is used in the proper way, that force is used correctly, and the next section is all about that. What happens when you don't have a choice but to use force? How would you do that? So in line 9, right off the bat, it says, calm detachment should be above all. So more than anything else, it has to be done in a calm and composed manner. So another way to say it is that if you must fight, it must not be with rage or anger. So what Lao Tzu suggests instead is calmness and detachment. So when you are calm in a fight, I want to point out that this is oftentimes contrary to the mentality in the West. What is the mentality in the West? It's the bulging eyes, the redness in the face, the rage, the roar, the come on, bring it on, that type of thing. It's the flexing of muscles, it's the shaking of the angry fist, all that. That is certainly not calm or composed or detached. So when you present in a conflict, you present calmness, composure, it may be mistaken. In that Western mindset, that wants to see the rage, it may be mistaken as weakness. In that regard, the ancient Chinese saw the calmness differently. They saw that it is the best way to be effective and efficient, that you know what to do, that you're not taken up by emotions, that you can calmly step aside to avoid an incoming charge, and you can take effective action to dispatch your enemies. So rather than a weakness, it's actually a strength. If you can keep composure, you know what to do. Now, I'm also going to admit right off the bat that this is more difficult to do than to talk about. To talk about it is very easy. Yeah, stay cool in a fight. Keep it cool, chill. We talk about that all the time. But as has often been said, everybody has a plan to win a fight until they're hit in the face. Then they go nuts. Then all the calmness and composure go out the window. They're just lashing out, striking out, hoping to land something. So much of martial arts training, and I know some of you are into martial arts, a lot of martial arts training is to be able to cultivate that mindset so you know what to do in an extreme situation and you can take the action you need to take calmly, with practice, with effectiveness honed by years of training. That's martial arts. Okay, let's move on. So next line, line 10, you see victorious but without glory. So this requires a little bit of explanation as far as characters. So the first thing I'll do is I'll isolate this character here, which you see is being repeated in line 10 as well as line 11. What is this character? This character is Mei. What does it mean? Well, typically in modern Mandarin, it means beauty or beautiful. So this is used a lot, especially in female names. So it's very common. Most Chinese names are composed of 3 characters. Some Chinese names have 2 characters. So whether it's 3 characters or 2, The first character is the family name, the surname, which in my case is Lin. Then it's followed by either one or two characters in the given name. So that given name could just be a single character like this one here, Mei. More often, it's combined with another character for greater variety. Now, having said all that, I gotta come back to this and point out that here, in this context, Mei does not mean beauty or beautiful. So when you check with the English translation here, you're not gonna see beauty or beautiful. That's because in the ancient context, the character is extended in terms of meaning to mean beautifully glorious. Specifically, this is about the ego-driven desire to look good in being victorious, to look like the victor, the strong, powerful victor. So the character Mei is no longer used in this way in modern Mandarin. No one will use it in this fashion about Mei being used to mean glory. But here, in the ancient context, it's definitely glory, glorify, glorious. So this is one of the examples where the ancient use of Chinese characters is different from modern Mandarin. Let's move on. Let's put the characters together in that line to talk about what it means. So line 10, 胜而不美, 4 characters, translated as victorious but without glory. Let's take a look at these 4 characters one by one. So literally, they mean, the first character means win or victorious or victory. And then the second character, a connective, is but. Third character is no or not. Last character, that's the character for Mei, which means beauty or beautiful normally, but here means glory, glorify, or glorious. So win but not glorious. Victory but without glory. That's what it means. So to connect with the previous line, to connect this with the previous line, which says calm detachment should be above all, what it says is that if you are able to bring that calmness, that deadly, effective, efficient calmness into battle, it gives you an edge. It gives you the best chance for victory. But when you do win, when you do best your opponent, it is without the glory that most people associate with the victorious. Most people would cheer the victor, and the victor would prance and flaunt. In the Tao, that's a big no-no. Because why did you have to fight? What sense did that make? Not a good thing. And whether you win or lose the fight itself is a cause for regret. Because you couldn't have done it, you couldn't have resolved the problem in a different and better way. So, regardless of winning or losing, the Tao cultivator regrets having to fight, having to cause damage, and possibly kill. So that's why there's no glory associated with it. It was a bad thing that you engaged in, even if you win. So now let's talk about 11 and 12. Those who glorify are delighted in the killing. So I think this is easy to understand. I think this is reflective of human nature and also modern times. So easy to understand, easy to see that those who glorify military victories tend to be the ones who also take pleasure in killing. It's closely related. It's a bloodthirsty mentality. It's a warlike element that is present in human nature, no matter where you go, no matter which country, which culture, which ethnicity, which background you're talking about. It exists as part of human nature everywhere. Hence this bullet. This warlike element exists in every culture. Some may think we are more enlightened now in the modern world, but a quick check in the news quickly dispels that notion. So all around the world, we're still seeing conflicts in quite a few places. So have human beings really changed that much? I would say human nature has remained consistent throughout history. And in fact, I would take it one step further. Some may say, well, yeah, if you are talking about the Middle East, third world countries where it's very chaotic, where there's so many warlike factions, but in the developed world, here in the West, no, we're past all that. We're past glorifying war. We're past looking upon the military with admiration. We're past being warlike. And to someone who says that, I would say, really? I still see signs of worshiping the mighty in terms of military prowess. I still see signs where war is presented as glorious, as primarily patriotic, and the negative elements of warfare, the death and destruction, the maiming, the horrible damage and injuries, those are skipped over. What is my evidence for saying that? Well, I'll just present a couple of images that kind of make my point for me. Here's the image of a military parade. So one cannot look at that and not see how the military is being glorified. So I'm not necessarily saying that this is a very bad thing. I'm saying that this is part of human nature. To be aware of it is to be able to keep it in check, to not let it go out of control. And this is, of course, a military parade, Bastille Day in Paris. Closer to home, I've got this as an example. What is this? This is a movie being made. The name of this movie, I think, should be familiar to everyone. There's a sequel that's coming right up, should be in theaters pretty soon. This movie is Top Gun. So that is definitely verging on military propaganda. And the commonality in glorifying warfare is to emphasize patriotic sentiments. The crisp uniform, the strong men and women in the armed forces, the teamwork, the fellowship, brotherhood, sisterhood, looking out for one another, taking care of one another, play those up. Downplay the gruesome aspects of war, the maiming, the killing of flesh and blood human beings who have friends and families who will mourn their loss. This is because in order to glorify, it is always necessary to present the enemy as preferably faceless, nameless, indeed less period, as in less than human. It's necessary. Why? Because we human beings have a natural empathy. We can't take it if we get to know someone as a person and then have to kill him or her. We have to create the illusion that enemies are subhuman, that it's okay to kill them, that they're not people. Unfortunately, that illusion falls apart very quickly. So for that reason, and many others, the Tao is opposed to the glorification of warfare. And the Tao challenges you to open your eyes and see through the images presented to you about how cool, how powerful, how great the military is. Instead, the Tao says, you gotta be realistic. You gotta understand the whole picture. It isn't just the good-looking, strong soldiers in uniform protecting the homeland. Well, a lot of times it's much uglier than what we're presented with. So moving on. So we're gonna probably do a few more and then reach for the summary for today. So now we're talking about lines 13 and 14. Those who delight in killing cannot achieve their ambitions upon the world. So historically, we have seen conquerors come and go. They have done a great deal of damage during the times that they were around, but because they move against the Tao, they don't last. They're not lasting. So let me present them as bullets. Historically, we have seen numerous examples where those who live by violence soon perish, and whatever they have accomplished in military victories die with them. So I'm using 3 examples that I used before, long time ago. The first one is Alexander the Great. He had an impressive record of 15 years of conquest. He started out while he was still a teenager. He was like 17 or 18 when he began his military career. When I was 17 or 18, I was still trying to figure out the world. So he continued on almost non-stop, 15 years of conquest. And he never lost a battle. He was said to be a military genius, never lost a battle. He died at the age of 32. He certainly proved the statement in the Tao that those who are opposed to the Tao will soon perish. He did not last. The age of 32. In this day and age, that's considered really young. Now, certainly, Alexander the Great was not the only example of great conquerors who came and went. Other examples that I used from previous presentations was Hitler and Caesar. So because we're running out of time now, I think time passed rather quickly today, but we're going to need to move to the summary. The summary is not going to take anyone by surprise. it's the rules that you have already seen now, the rules for the use of force when you have no choice. So let's go through the 5 rules. Number 1, you must recognize and acknowledge the extreme negativity associated with violence. So remember that all things detest the military or the use of force. It's an extreme negativity manifesting in the world. So that's something to understand first and foremost. It doesn't mean that you will never enact some sort of violence-related activity. But number 2, you must refrain from using force unless absolutely necessary, unless you have no choice whatsoever. That's rule number 2. Rule number 3, you must use force with calmness and detachment, and never out of anger or desire for vengeance. We see that a lot in movies, that main character, the hero, is out for vengeance, cutting down his enemies. In real life, it doesn't work that way. Number 4, you must never glorify your victories. The simple bottom line in the Tao is that those who do find glory and delight in killing will always fail. One example that I cited today, Alexander the Great. Other examples to follow, Hitler and Caesar. And rule number 5, so finally, you must understand the cost of victory and mourn the fallen. So we haven't gotten to that point yet in our line-by-line analysis. Next time we will get to number 5. And the understanding is that those who have fallen, even if they were your enemies, they are still fellow human beings, not so different from yourself. So these are the 5 rules for the use of force. So definitely, Tao cultivators are not shrinking violets. They want to avoid the use of force. But when the chips are down, they don't shy away from it. So that is what I want everyone to understand about the perspective of the Tao on violence.
Our meeting has come to an end, but the journey continues on. Let us travel safely. Until next time, may the Tao fill you with peace and happiness.